The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, my name is Jillian Schaefer and I'm the Marketing Coordinator for SWK Technologies. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, How New Cyber Threats Are Prompting a Fresh Look at Disaster Recovery, presented by James Slaby of Acronis. A little housekeeping before we get started. Everyone has been placed on mute to keep the background noise down. However, you can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar. To submit a question, look for the questions section in your GoToWebinar. We'll address all questions at the end of the presentation. We are recording this presentation and it will be distributed tomorrow to all attendees as well as to those who registered but were not able to attend. Please take a moment after the presentation to answer our one survey question. With that said, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to attend our webinar. We're here to help you get the most out of your software solutions and help you find an easier way to run your business by providing you software and industry knowledge, tools, and support whenever you need it. We've invited Acronis here today because they are the industry experts on cybersecurity and disaster recovery. So whether you're here doing research for a new solution or you're just here to learn, we'd like to encourage you to ask any questions throughout the webinar. Lastly, as a quick reminder, SWK is constantly sharing important updates and software tips and tricks on our social media channels, so we encourage you to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to James.
Thank you for that introduction, Jolene. Let me get my screen up here.
And it's coming through great, James.
Fantastic. Thanks, everybody. Welcome to today's session. I'm going to be talking about how cybersecurity threats really suggest that businesses of all stripes need to take a second look at disaster recovery, and I'll spend some time talking about how increasingly the disciplines of cybersecurity, backup, and disaster recovery are converging. So I won't spend a lot of time talking about myself. You can go to my LinkedIn profile if you want to see the whole rigmarole of 30 years or so in tech, but I've basically done two things in my career. One is product marketing roles like my current one at Acronis for tech vendors in cybersecurity and networking. And I've also been an industry analyst at places like Forrester and Yankee Group covering cybersecurity and networking as well. So that's me. Let's jump into our agenda. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about cybersecurity threats. The world that we're in today is obviously quite fraught. New headlines are in the mainstream press every day of a major new cyber attack. And so people that didn't at all care about cybersecurity issues seem to know a little bit about it anymore. I'm not as definitely at cocktail parties when I mention that my job is in cybersecurity. I'll then talk about modern disaster recovery, and the goal here is to give people a sense that moving from a pure cybersecurity data protection type of environment where you're trying to integrate security and backup a little more closely is a really good staging ground to add disaster recovery. The discipline is really not as scary as you might think. At Acronis, we like to say that we're democratizing DR for mid-market and smaller companies that historically have thought DR is too expensive, it's too complicated. That's for large enterprises that have big staffs and big budgets. That's not us. And I'm going to kind of lead you through the process of the same process that we lead our customers with the help of partners like SWK into setting up and operating disaster recovery as a cloud service. It's cool stuff, and hopefully you'll come away with it thinking that's something I could do. We'll then take your questions live. Jolene is collecting those in the background for me. And then I'll wrap up with just pointing you to a couple of reading resources that you might find educational. So let's talk about the cybersecurity environment. You know, historically, when you thought about business continuity and potentially disaster recovery, the things we tend to focus on are natural disasters. You know, I'm in a tornado zone, I'm in a coastal area that's subject to flooding. Could my facilities be at risk of fire? Am I in an airport runway or flyover zone where a plane might crash into my building? These are all things that DR pros tend to think about. And they get a little bit more fraught these days as the climate changes and more coastal areas are flooding. Storms are getting more violent, snowstorms more violent. You look at what happened in Texas and how that affected their power grid. So still a significant threat. Pandemic's kind of a new one that we probably weren't thinking about a few years ago, but that really has the potential to bring down the business if you're not prepared to reshape the way you deliver application services and are able to support workers working out of home. Hardware and software failure we've always had to worry about. Disk drives fail, software bugs occur, networks go down, and small and medium businesses in particular seem to be at risk from this because they don't have the resources or tools to keep a close eye on those resources. Human errors also account for a significant chunk of potential outages that you might have to worry about shifting over to standby resources. But really what I'm here to talk about is cyber attacks, because particularly in the past few years, I've been at Acronis for 7 years, and I've spent the last 5 years talking to audiences like this one about the threat of ransomware and more recently tech supply chain attacks. This is probably ascended to be the most serious threat that's likely to take down your business. And partly it's just that cyber criminals have gotten more clever, mimicking the methods of the software as a service industry. They basically are structured like Salesforce, but for evil. Smart developers in the back end, an army of not as technically adept distributors whose sole job is to craft phishing emails to get ransomware onto an endpoint so that it can spread throughout a business from there. And the distributors get cut in for a piece of the pie when the back end folks, the product developers, make a sale. They actually collect a ransom. So it's very much like the SaaS business in terms of R&D and distribution and revenue sharing. So that's enabled them to scale incredibly well, and that's why we see so many more frequent attacks. You don't have to read the tech press, bleeping computer and dark reading and secure computing and all the other tech pubs that I follow to be aware of how pervasive and frequent ransomware threats are these days. There's some, if the malware folks start threatening your planned post-pandemic road trip because they've shut down fuel pipelines and gas stations are out of gas, or they're threatening your weekend barbecue because meat processing plants have been taken offline by a ransomware attack, suddenly everybody is acutely aware of this issue and they're reading about it in their general press newspapers, not just the tech press. And again, I can remember about 10 years ago, our security folks would sample a few hundred new instances of malware a day. Our current cyber protection operations centers around the world are now detecting 600,000 new malware samples every day. So that's incredibly difficult for us to keep up with, and we're in that business. You can imagine what the typical small business, 200, 150 employees, they have no hope of keeping up with the sheer volume and the increasing sophistication of these attacks. A lot of us had to move a little bit more abruptly to the cloud than we had planned for when the pandemic hit, and we didn't all have the polished skills that we needed in terms of managing those cloud applications and resources. So that's led to a lot of breaches over the past 15 months or so. How much do you know about properly configuring containers? That's something most of us hadn't heard of a few years ago. So that unfamiliarity, lack of skill led to some serious vulnerabilities. Remote work, of course, is another issue. It's not hard for you to guess my Wi-Fi cable modem router's password if I haven't changed it from the factory default, and most of us working from home wouldn't think to do that. And there are dozens of other vulnerabilities. We uncovered vulnerabilities in things like Microsoft Teams and Zoom that had to be closed. VPNs were exposed as having many vulnerabilities. It's we were making do, but compared to my office environment in suburban Boston, where I'm behind a firewall and intrusion prevention systems, and there's a couple of tech guys down the hall keeping an eye on things and there to help me, compared to my home environment where I've got consumer grade gear, maybe sometimes I'm doing some work not on the Acronis supplied laptop, but my personal tablet or laptop, that's obviously not going to be as robust, not as carefully patched or updated, and that led to a lot of breaches in the past couple of years as well. A threat that not many of us were thinking about, I think probably before December when news of the SolarWinds breach hit, is this issue of tech supply chain attacks. So the idea here is criminals compromise a technology supplier, in this case SolarWinds and their very popular network monitoring and management tool, compromise the software repository for that with malware. There are tens of thousands of customers for this product, tech operations people that are using it to keep an eye on their networks, download the latest update and get infected with malware that way, and the criminals get to steal sensitive data from a couple hundred companies. Pretty serious, and it means that you have to kind of take a harder look at your own tech supply chain. Who are you getting software and services from, and are they doing everything that they should to prevent themselves from becoming a link in a attack chain that is aimed at your business? And again, we've seen more and more of these attacks. Microsoft Exchange servers got compromised a few months ago, and it looks like left behind trapdoors even after people applied the patches that Microsoft supplied to close those vulnerabilities. Ransomware is obviously the big bad boy on the block in the malware world these days. Historically, it's been about getting malware on your system, quietly encrypting your files, presenting you with a note that says, pay us this amount in cryptocurrency, typically Bitcoin, or you'll never see your files again. If you pay us, we'll give you the decryption key and you can get back in business. Well, they've gotten a little more devious than that in recent months. Now they will quietly steal a bunch of your data first before they trigger the encryption attack. And now we'll say, look, you can buy the key back from us or not, but if you don't, we're going to leak your data online. And that's potentially embarrassing. It might be sensitive intellectual property, your marketing or business plans, maybe information about your customers that they don't want to see leaked and could put you in compliance violation, all kinds of reasons that you don't want to leak that data. So it's a great pressure tactic. And they've got other things like, if you don't pay us, not only will we leak your data, but we'll keep inflicting distributed denial of service attacks, so none of your web servers will work until you pay us. They're getting cleverer about defeating countermeasures like backup, or they'll disable your cybersecurity tools, try to shut off your antivirus. They'll exploit tools that you have and are using for good purposes, like your remote desktop tools and your password management tools and your backup tools to spread malware on your network, exfiltrate sensitive data. So it's kind of a much more complicated, more advanced persistent threat-like threat that we've got to deal with, and the frequency just kind of keeps going up by week. Even Macs aren't safe. Historically we thought Macs were super secure, and they're really not anymore. Criminals are equal opportunity. They're going after every vertical, government institutions, companies of all sizes. So things like the Colonial Pipeline attack in the U.S., where most of the Southeast had a gas shortage, panic buying, spike in prices is a famous one. But you may not be aware of like the attack on British universities or the Irish healthcare system, CNA Financial, a big insurance company here in the US, including cyber insurance, ironically, ended up being hit with a $60 million ransom demand. They managed to negotiate it down to 40 million. But, imagine having that hit your budget. I'm sure that's an expense that they didn't foresee coming. And, for 2 weeks, they were effectively offline. And we're just this is a slide I could update every day. I come back to it every couple of weeks with a more prominent news. In fact, this one's a little out of date. We know that JBS paid $11 million in their ransomware attack. And apparently they were more concerned about data leaking than getting their data online. It sort of looks like they were able to restore from backup, so they didn't really need the decryption key, but they paid 11 million bucks anyway to prevent the attackers from leaking information. I don't know if it's like how they make their sausages or what, but Colonial Pipeline paid nearly $5 million in ransom. And the issue there was not that the operations of the pipeline were shut down. They shut down the pipeline themselves because their billing systems were taken offline, and they didn't want to ship fuel to people that they couldn't ultimately bill and collect the revenue from. Now, the FBI managed to claw back a couple $1 million in Bitcoin from that attack, but that's really unusual circumstances that led to that, and most of us can't ever expect that kind of help from government or law enforcement to get any of a ransom back. I'll just point out one more on here just because it's a pretty well-known financial services firm, Travelex. If you see their currency exchanges in airports all over the world, and they have a payment card that you can load up with cash and use like a credit card or a debit card in foreign countries without the risk of those numbers being stolen over there. Their ransomware attack took them offline for a month and basically pushed them into bankruptcy. They've had laid off a big chunk of their workforce, and they still haven't emerged from bankruptcy as of this month. So these truly can be an existential threat to your business. So if you're considering disaster recovery, I would suggest that cyber attacks, for all the reasons I've just gone over here, are probably the most compelling reason that you might want to take a look at it. All right, I'm right on time here. This is a rare event. All right, so let's talk about the process of considering why you might need disaster recovery. And again, this is a kind of a mature kind of model that we've been using for a long time to help people that might consider a DR solution understand what it is that they're protecting and why they would do it. In other words, you go through this process on paper, and it will make the process of selling your management on the concept of disaster recovery, particularly as a hedge against cyber attacks, a lot easier. We'll say, I understand that investment. Like we are buying insurance for other assets of the company. Why not do something that can help ensure our uptime instead of absorbing huge one-time costs in the wake of an attack where we're offline for weeks or a month and potentially threatened with going out of business. We turn this into an operating expense that really mitigates the threat of a days or weeks long downtime event in the same way that insurance of physical assets does. So 6 steps here. I'm going to take you briefly through each of these, but the idea is basically let's understand all the things that we have that are at risk. Let's pinpoint what those vulnerabilities and threats are to them, what the kind of intersection of our assets with threats and vulnerabilities, in other words, our risk posture, it potentially could cost the business if those threats and vulnerabilities came to bite us. Let's assess our cost of downtime, what it means when specific business processes are offline, what that costs us in terms of lost orders, customer trust, maybe stock value if we're a publicly held company. And having quantified that, let's look at some options for a disaster recovery solution, because there are two popular models right now, and choosing between them is kind of important to the business case. And then once we have chosen that solution, let's make sure that we drill and test on it so that we understand what it's like to undergo a disaster recovery, but not under live fire. So asset inventory, this is basically, let's figure out what we have so we can figure out what's at risk. For instance, we have a tool that we provide our customers that makes this very easy. It goes out and discovers every device, what its operating system is, what kind of processors it's using, whether it's part of a cluster or if there's virtual machines involved, how much storage it has, who's using it, what are their roles, where, everything we need to know about it physically. And again, the tools these days make it a lot easier, make that process kind of automatic. All right. Risk assessment is the next step here. Identify all the potential threats that might result in downtime. So for example, think about power outages, natural disasters, pandemic suddenly making your data center inaccessible, right? Vulnerabilities, cyber attacks, software updates that you haven't applied. So you've got vulnerabilities that you haven't patched yet because it's hard to keep up with all the new updates that are coming from all your vendors. I think the typical business has unpatched vulnerabilities that are over 3 months old just because it's a treadmill that it's hard to keep up with. You've got insider threats, either innocuous ones like a tech making mistake in a software update, or malicious threats. You've got an insider with a grudge and wants to take it out on the company. And increasingly now we have to worry about state-sponsored attacks. So the SolarWinds attack and the Microsoft Exchange attack I mentioned, those were mounted by hostile state actors, not just criminal cyber gangs. So they've got geopolitical as well as economic incentives to steal your data. And frankly, they're a lot tougher to deal with. All right. So next step is risk assessment, and this is basically figuring out everything that can possibly affect the performance of your business processes, their integrity, right? So you weigh up all the threats that we talked about, kind of tick those off. This is kind of a documentation exercise here. Toad up all the vulnerabilities, and then we come to a combination of those two to categorize the risk, identify our tolerance for risk. Is this a business process that is bringing revenue into the company? Is it really kind of an overhead process? Order entry, very high risk to the company if that goes down. HR, maybe that can be offline for a few days and really won't affect us, certainly won't affect our customers or our partners in any way. And then identifying steps that, like, all right, how do we mitigate this risk? If it's a cybersecurity attack, what are we doing from a people process technology perspective to identify attacks, stop them, mitigate their effects, and figure out ways to kind of continually upgrade there. Those are steps that you would take to mitigate cybersecurity risks. If it's risks from power outages, maybe we invest in uninterruptible power supplies and reduce some of the risk that way. And then identify who's actually going to do this, who's going to take charge of a particular project of mitigating risk for a particular business process, right? The process of assessing the impact on the business, this might look familiar to you if you spent any time building a backup regimen. So if you're not familiar with recovery point objectives, the simple version is how far back can we go in trying to recover from a data loss or an outage? In other words, is yesterday's backup good enough, Or is this process so important and in real time that we really want to go no back further than an hour or two, which means you've got to be backing up with frequently enough to hit that objective. The recovery time objective is basically how long can we, how long will it take us to get a process back online if we have to recover from a backup? And then you'll see MTD, which is maximum tolerable downtime. That's basically at what point in our recovery process is it taking so long that it's really hurting the business? So you, having understood that you get your handle on, you get your arms around these three figures, you're in a much better position to kind of assess the impact of the business of outages. How much data can we afford to lose? How quickly can we get back online? At what point does downtime of a process start hurting our revenue, hurting our reputation, losing us customers, losing us future revenue opportunities? So the goal at this point is to kind of bring those all together, rating the downtime and the severity risk for every business process. Is its downtime is it mild? Is it medium? Is it dire for the business? And then try to quantify the bottom line impact. And this bit is a little bit tricky to do with the great confidence in the accuracy of it. But for business case building, I think we can all take a swag at it. Depending on your industry, there's probably some good research that shows what the average cost of downtime is if you're in banking and financial services or real-time manufacturing. But we can take a swag at this. We can say, all right, what's our revenue divided by working hours per year? And you can come up with a kind of a rough cost by business process for how much interruption in that service is costing the business. And then understanding that there's research that shows that, particularly if you're a small and medium business, if you have an outage of a week or more, there's like a 90% chance in 6 months that you'll be out of business. It's we think once you get to this figure, that's something you can take to your management and say, this is a really good insurance policy, and it's something we really got to consider because our risk from cybersecurity breaches, downtime, loss of data is a lot more severe than it was just 2 or 3 years ago, and it's getting worse. The big decision at this point is, do we build or do we go with as a service? So historically, building your own was the choice of enterprises. You build a standby data center and license software for it and configure your network in such a way that when you need to fail over to a standby location, you do that and you're managing the whole process. Much like the way the software world has moved away from a owned and operated by the end user with all the associated capital depreciation and lack of elasticity, you go to as a service. Now your provider owns and operates the software and the infrastructure it runs on, though they are typically using cloud services as well for that. And you're just paying a per seat cost on a monthly basis. So you're turning it from a capital expense to an operating expense. You got much more flexible in terms of demand. It's easier to add and reduce capacity as your needs change. So all the advantages of SaaS we're basically applying to disaster recovery, and that really puts it within the reach, both from a cost and a complexity standpoint, of much smaller businesses than used to be able to consider it before. So finally, once you do make that choice, and again, we're going to push it to our solution, which is disaster recovery as a service, you want to test your setup. In other words, go through the exercise of what happens if we do get hit by a ransomware attack. At what point do we make the decision that recovering from backup is either not an option, maybe they encrypted our backups, or it's going to take so long that that's going to exceed our maximum tolerable downtime. So we want to throw over to our standby resources, which in this case are just your apps, your data replicated into virtual machines in the cloud. So hitting that switch where you're now pointing users from wherever their servers and data were before to now these duplicate resources in the cloud is a really relatively simple process. So you gotta build your plan to do this, test it early and often, at least once a year, figure out what did and didn't go smoothly, who was supposed to do something in the process, say notify employees that they were going to see a change, that they were going to be switched over to new destinations and not to be concerned if they suddenly saw new URLs appearing in their browser clients. And you want to do this kind of testing when, your management and the world, the media, your partners, your customers, your investors aren't scrutinizing you and saying, oh, what are you doing? When are we going to get back online again? So the model is very much one of, drilling for a fire. You don't want to figure out what your path out of the building is the first time when there's actually flames licking at your heels. So this testing is really important. All right. I'm going to keep the commercial here super brief because if you want to know more about what we're doing, SWK is more than happy to talk to you about it. I'll just point out that the way we structure our product is backup and cybersecurity first, and these are very tightly integrated in a way that's kind of really useful. So when your backup and your security tools talk to each other, there's benefits to both. So in the case of, for instance, we are able to scan our backups where they reside, say, in the cloud, and remove any malware that we detect there and patch any vulnerabilities that we have there so that you can be sure that when you do have to make a restoral, you're restoring a clean, safe image of your apps and your data. So that's kind of our base claim to fame, and that's what most of our ultimate customers are buying through the help of partners like SWK. But we also provide like a broad range of tools for the managed service providers who are typically delivering these services so that they can very effectively bundle backup, cybersecurity, and disaster recovery as a service, single agent on the endpoint, one console in your operations center, and a lot of flexibility in terms of what you use for storage. It can be your storage, it can be Acronis's cloud storage, it can be any one of the big operators, Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, and integration with all your typical MSP tools, your RMM and your PSA. We've got hooks into all of those. So this has turned out to be a super popular solution with our MSP partners. And, they find themselves able to deliver a host of really interesting services that their customers are excited about, because nobody in the SMB space is having a good time trying to fight off cyber threats in this particular era. All right, enough about Acronis. I think it's time to get to Q&A, and boy, I'm right on time again. I feel like I'm on fire in terms of hitting my deadlines for not keeping people too long at a webinar. Jolene, can you offer me some questions from the audience?
Thank you, James. We'll now open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please enter them into the question section of your GoToWebinar. And just a reminder, everyone, we do have a subject matter expert here. This is a great opportunity to have your questions answered in real time. And we did have a few questions come in during the webinar, James. The first being, how does double extortion ransomware change how we defend against it? It's not enough to back up anymore?
All right, so you actually know the term for the ransomware attack where they steal your data first and then threaten to leak it. So that's really good. So the idea here is increasingly criminals have figured out that people are backing up their data, and if they can't get to the backups and encrypt them because they've done a good job of keeping them offsite or keeping them in the cloud, following good best practices for backup, which means they're just going to restore their data and say, sorry, we're not paying you any ransom. We're fine. We're back in business again. So this is what leads to double extortion, where they'll steal your data first and say, look, we don't care if you recover or not. We're going to leak your data if you don't pay us. What this suggests is that you want to take all the steps that you can to prevent the attack from happening in the first place. So one of the ways that we help our MSP partners do that is with our agent includes anti-malware that's both signature-based and has this machine intelligence-enabled behavioral anti-malware, which is able to identify attacks by what they're doing, not what they look like. And this combination of the two is really important because most ransomware attacks these days are 0 days. You remember me, 600,000 new iterations of malware a day. That's because they are revving their instantiations of ransomwares to evade signature-based countermeasures. The malware attacking your system is going to have a fingerprint that has not been seen before. So you really need this behavioral anti-ransomware kind of capability that will say like, oh, I can see what you're doing. You're renaming files. You're encrypting them. You're exfiltrating data. I know you're a bad actor. I'm going to terminate you, and I'm going to undo any work you've done on our data by restoring files from local cache. So that's nice and invisible from the customer standpoint. But it's not enough if the criminals have stolen the data first before they triggered the encryption attack, which means that you need to complement that endpoint anti-malware with things like data loss prevention and network behavioral analysis tools like UEBA is the category of tools that baseline and track user behaviors so that when suddenly a process starts transferring lots of data to a cloud destination at 2 in the morning that you haven't seen before, that looks suspicious. And having awareness of that means that you'll be able to root out and stop that threat. So basically, anti-malware is still super important. We're still going to catch and zap and recover from ransomware attacks in real time, and we've got a great third-party validated track record in terms of very low false positive rates. We're not going to accidentally kill processes that are legitimately trying to encrypt files. But you really need to complement that with tools that will help you identify suspicious data flows out of your network. That's the surest way to tamp down double extortion. Good question.
We have another. Should we get law enforcement involved after a cyber attack?
So if you ask the FBI, yeah, they absolutely want to know about every attack. And so, yes, you should get them involved, or at least notify them that that you've been attacked. The next step is the FBI is going to tell you, don't pay the ransom. That is, just encourages the cyber criminals. They know that this is going to be a profitable business, and they're going to keep at it, and they're going to, plow back some of their ill-gotten gains into developing more sophisticated attacks. So don't pay. My company is in the business of helping MSPs stop ransomware attacks on their clients. And I think that that's whether you pay or not is a complicated question. And again, if you've done the kind of risk analysis in the run-up to thinking about DR, you'll have a better handle on what it means. It's like, well, if it's going to take us 2 weeks to recover from our backups, it's going to cost us this. Maybe it's cheaper to pay off this ransom in Bitcoin so that we can get up and running again. Of course, there aren't great guarantees that paying the ransom will always get you back online. We've seen decryption keys that don't work. or decryption algorithms that are so slow that it takes months. I think this was one of the reasons that Colonial Pipeline paid their $4 million ransom, was to get a faster recovery than they could do on their own. But generally, they're pretty good. The crooks know that they don't want to kill the golden goose, and they provide things like 24-hour online chat support to help you figure out where to source Bitcoin and to help you through the recovery process. So again, they're trying to be like a legit SaaS business with good customer service. So the word doesn't get out that like, oh, we paid and stuff didn't work. We were still stuck without our data. We're still, all our systems were still offline. They want to be good providers of software, including the remedy to their initial software. But that is the kind of decision that I don't think there is a good hard and fast rule about paying the ransom. But kind of one of the main reasons I'm here today is to tell you that if you've got DR, that really greatly increases your flexibility. You flip over to your standby resources, and that gives you time to mitigate, to recover, or at least buy some time so that you can make that decision of, does it make sense to pay these folks to prevent them from leaking our data or not? So there are a bunch of advantages aside from the DR that it greatly reduces that recovery time objective. It really takes RTO off the table, and that you can switch over almost instantaneously to the standby resources in the cloud. And depending on how recently you've backed up each application with relatively low data loss, and hopefully you've set your recovery point objectives appropriately for the business criticality of the process. So again, yesterday's backup might be good enough for some internal sources, but for customer-facing sources like order entry or help desk or things like that, you might want to say like, well, we don't want to lose more than an hour of data. So depending on how well you've hedged against an attack with good backup, with good cybersecurity, with good DR, that will tell you what the difference in cost between paying the ransom and not paying the ransom. So, you know, the FBI has the broader interests of society at heart, but that doesn't help your particular situation when you've been attacked. So, you know, we no longer say, as we once did, agree with the FBI and never pay the ransom. It's kind of a long-winded way of getting to that answer, but that's a tricky subject. I think it deserves some exploration.
We have another. Do you offer a free cyber threat evaluation for potential Acronis clients?
You know, I am almost certain that if you're talking about, well, there's a few ways to answer this question, right? One, we have this resource that I'm going to point you to that many of our partners use to take prospects through identifying their cyber risk profile. From a DR standpoint, yeah, we've got solutions engineers standing by to sit down and help take you through this process. I don't know how far they go before they say, well, we really need to start charging you for this because this is very expensive expertise that you're getting the advantage of. But certainly that initial conversation is very easy to set up. And I've got, again, I've got resources at the end here that will show you how to do that, how to set up a detailed demo. You know, I don't want to pitch our product too hard here today. This is more, we're here to educate, but certainly we are happy to talk to you if you want to learn more and maybe see if there's a fit there.
We have two more. How do we protect ourselves against things like the Microsoft Exchange server breach?
Okay. I touched on the issue of tech supply chain attacks because that's suddenly much more urgent, or something we're much more aware of than we were a year ago. You know, the SolarWinds attack got disclosed in December, but that threat had been lurking in target's network for a couple of years before I think it was FireEye sort of accidentally discovered something suspicious going on and traced it all back and figured out, oh my God, there's 10,000 systems that are infected with this malware that's been lurking in their networks and quietly stealing data for a couple of years, right? The Microsoft Exchange Server vulnerability, the Hafnium attack, was another state-sponsored attack. And that one was serious enough that even after, I alluded to this before, Microsoft provided patches for it, people installed the patches, but the law enforcement was convinced that there were still trapdoors left behind in the networks and kind of barged their way into a lot of corporate and government networks and said, we're going to look around for this threat because we don't believe you may have prevented it from recurring again by installing those patches to close the known vulnerabilities, but you've probably still got a Trojan lurking here, and we want to get it out so that this state actor does not get more of your data. So it's a bit of a tricky question. This is why I wrote an ebook that I'm going to point you to at the end that is basically about assessing the risk of your supply chain partners. Hopefully, your tech vendors are looking at this attack and going like, we're going to get this question from our customers and prospects. We better have a good answer for what we're doing to prevent ourselves from becoming a link in a supply chain attack. And, you know, if you had half an hour, I could tell you everything Acronis was doing around that, including secure software development processes, the security of our cyber protection operation centers, our data centers around the world. So we've got that. But what you need as a service provider is a way to go to your customers and prospects and say, look, we've taken these steps. Oh, by the way, you could use the same framework that we did on yourself to kind of assess your own risk posture. But here we are, we've taken these steps, we've gone through this, and I kind of lay out a sort of a mini subset of the NIST framework to help you focus on the kind of the biggest vulnerabilities in the attack chain that cyber criminals have used or state actors have used in mounting these supply chain attacks. It's really a serious problem if you're an MSP. So you want to really have a story to tell there, and hopefully with the help of this ebook, you can craft that. So that's these threats are incredibly sophisticated. They're like the kind of advanced persistent threats that state actors used to only mount on other state actors. I think about the attack that the U.S. and Israel mounted on the Iranians to bring down their uranium refinement facility 10 years ago, and how effective that was. But now they're turning those kind of tools, their unlimited patience, unlimited budgets, access to really great cyber talent, including from like the criminal pool, and they're setting their sights on businesses to further their ends. Either it's to steal intellectual property or identify vulnerabilities they could use in a future cyber attack. You know, you look at the North Koreans, they're basically funding their whole regime with malware because a lot of their traditional sources of trade revenue have been shut off to them by international sanctions. So the worst or the most sophisticated actors out there are now targeting businesses. And the only way that you're going to fend those off ultimately is through a multi-layered approach. You're going to have to really train your people better at security awareness, so they're not clicking on phishing emails. That's still 90% of successful malware incursions come because an employee clicks on a email link or attachment that they shouldn't. So that's an important process part of the equation. And you're ultimately going to have to think about scenarios where you are breached, because the likelihood increasingly is that you will get breached. So what's your failover strategy? What is your incident response plan outside of disaster recovery? You know, what are you going to do to contain the attack? How are you going to communicate it to your employees, regulators, your partners and customers, the press, the investor community, your bankers, having a good crisis communication plan in place. And again, just like you do with DR, rehearsing it so everybody knows what their job is. You've got a list of all the vendors that you have to contact, and it's printed out. It's not on a server that might be inaccessible in the wake of an attack. That you've got primary and secondary people identified, who to wake up at 1 in the morning on a weekend if you have to, and kind of practice these things. To go through tabletop and live simulations of attacks on weekends. And these kind of things will help you really minimize the potential damage, not just to loss of data and downtime, but broader damage to your reputation, the trust of your partners, your ability to renew contracts with your customers. So there's the technology piece to kind of fend off the attacks. There's the process piece to kind of help prevent attacks from getting in the first place. The people skills that you have to develop, and then really think about it in the same way that we think about physical attacks. There's only so much defense that you can build around things. You got to understand that a determined adversary is going to find a way in, and thus incident response becomes a really important tool for minimizing, containing the potential damage. So disaster recovery, I think, has a real part to play there in terms of minimizing the disruption to your business and loss of data, your ability to get back up and running again very quickly in the wake of an attack. But tech supply chain attacks, they're complicated. There's a lot more that you have to think about to really defend against them. And so I'm urging our MSP leaders in the audience to think about what you're going to do, what kind of story you're going to tell your customers, and look at it as an opportunity. Say, look, we can help you figure out how to prevent yourself from becoming a victim. And we've got this range of very neatly integrated services where we can basically take that concern off your plate. We'll assume it for a small monthly fee per user or per gigabyte of data that we're protecting on your behalf. Sorry, that's a complicated one, but it requires a windy answer.
No worries. We have one last one. I'm already an Acronis backup user. Can I just add disaster recovery to my account?
Yes. Simple answer is yes. We hope that you're starting from the point of, let's look at this from a service provider perspective. Yeah, you can absolutely deliver backup as a service and then add cybersecurity services and or disaster recovery. They're all kind of discrete components of the platform that you can add and mix and match as you see fit. The good news from your perspective is it's all one platform. It's Acronis Cyber Protect Cloud is the foundation of all of those: backup, cybersecurity, disaster recovery, and it's always a single agent on the endpoint and one console that you manage it from, and with plugs into your RMM and PSA. So a nifty way, we think, to be able to offer a suite of those services. You lead with anti-ransomware and a backup, and you've got an upsell opportunity with disaster recovery, and it's a very simple incremental change to your agreement with Acronis to be able to start delivering those services.
Perfect. And that looks like all the questions we have. James, did you have a few final thoughts to share before I close the webinar?
Yeah, let me I've been promising to share some resources here, so let's get to those. A bunch of content that you can download from the Acronis Resource Center. We won't even ask you for your email to get it. These are not gated in any way. But a couple of white papers that talk about DR as a process and help you kind of build the business case, the return on investment in it. That's a useful tool if you're selling to customers that are dubious about whether DR makes sense for them. A timeline, this basically kind of takes you through the sequence of a breach, a recovery, and a failback, kind of a useful way that if things are humming smoothly, this is what happens when you have some kind of an outage, whether it's from a cyber attack or a hurricane taking out your headquarters. And that's kind of just a neat framework for discussion. Data sheet, we'll talk about the features, and then there's the ebook I mentioned, which is basically explains how tech supply chain attacks typically work and the steps that you've got to take as a service provider to evaluate your own risk and thus be able to convince your prospects that you're not going to be a SolarWinds or a Microsoft Exchange in the next supply chain attack. IDC, this is my old job. I worked for competitors of theirs, but this is a nice independent third-party perspective from one of the leading guys, analysts covering DR backup. And he talks about the advantages of integrating cybersecurity with your backup, with your disaster recovery regimens. And so it's kind of a nice independent perspective that validates the approach that we've taken to solving these particular problems. Finally, if you want trial of the product or a demo or to talk to a DR specialist, just go to these links and someone will be happy to talk to you. Make sure that you mentioned that SWK was your entry point into this. We want to make sure that they get credit if we end up becoming one of your suppliers. Lastly, I'll just say, if you got the time and the wherewithal, we have this really worthy nonprofit foundation that builds schools and provides computer training to kids around the world in less advantaged countries. A lot of Acronis employees take time off to go build the schools. Super worthy cause, so consider donating to that. And that's all I got. Back to you, Jolene.
Thanks, James. Give me 1 minute as I take back screen control and close the webinar. Perfect. Thank you so much, James, for your informative presentation and for taking the time to be here today. And thank you everyone for attending our webinar. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, Jolene. Thanks, everybody.